Hello, my name is Ken Kinter, and I'm an assistant professor at Rutgers University. The purpose of this presentation is to discuss compassion, particularly for healthcare workers and helpers. So the project that I work for is called the State Hospital Psychiatric Rehabilitation Initiative. Basically, it's a collaboration between Rutgers University and New Jersey State Psychiatric Hospitals to improve the quality of care and working conditions there. None of this is possible without the financial and other types of support from the New Jersey Department of Health. So we got to give credit where credit is due. We thank them for their support and in our efforts going forward. And that's part of what makes this video and the others on our site possible. So our objectives for today, we're going to talk about a couple different things. We're going to talk about the difference between empathy and compassion. We're going to talk about self-compassion, which is a very important but under-publicized type of compassion. And we're going to talk about things that increase and decrease the amount of compassion that we have with us. And if you see some of the pictures on the side, I threw in a couple illustrations about different religious traditions and their view on compassion. So you're going to see a few of these as we go through, because compassion is pretty deeply rooted in both Western and Eastern religions. So let's start by talking about empathy and compassion, because they're sort of used interchangeably and they're close, but they're not exactly the same. So empathy has to do with sharing the feelings of another. If someone is sad, you feel sad with them, not necessarily for them. That's sympathy, and that's a different story. But you feel sad with them. You feel happy for someone else. It can be any of the emotions. Compassion is a type of empathy, but it has to do with sharing suffering, co-suffering with someone. So because a person suffers, you feel the impact of that suffering too. And very often what that can do is compel action to get you to perform a compassionate act. So for example, a few years ago, I broke my foot and I was on crutches for a few weeks, and I hated doors, especially those big heavy ones that you had to sort of open and get in the way before it closed. And then especially if you had to lock it on either side of you, it became really complicated with crutches. So to this day, I'm that guy that holds doors open for people because I am never in so much of a hurry that I can't at least try to remove a barrier from someone who already has trouble ambulating. So I have a question for you. In your life, I'm sure you've been through some adversity and some difficulty. Has that caused you to be more compassionate toward other people who have a similar issue? Anything you've been through, you sort of have this invisible kinship with that person who's been through it because you know what that's been like. So I'd ask you to think about that. And how does that impact in your life now? Has that resulted in more compassion for you? Has it resulted in possibly less? An interesting question. We'll see more about that as we go. So a type of compassion we don't hear about often enough, and it's really the starting point of compassion, is self-compassion. How do you treat yourself? How do you deal with your own inner critic or your own judgments about yourself? Because it's the literal double-edged sword. How you judge yourself and are critical to yourself is very often how judgmental and critical you are to other people. So if you can't have compassion for yourself, it's very difficult for you to be compassionate towards someone else. And in some traditions, it's believed that if you are not full of compassion, you're full of suffering. The more suffering you have, the less compassionate you can be. And in an extreme sense, that suffering spills out onto the people around you. So the question is, how much suffering do you experience daily as part of your work and your life, both in terms of the suffering that you may have to go through as part of a very rigorous job, the suffering that you experience through others, and then we have suffering that comes from our professional and our personal lives as well. And that's all cumulative, and that all impacts us. And again, the more suffering we have and that we're carrying, the less compassionate we can be to others. So part of the mechanism to overcoming these limitations on self-compassion is dealing with shame. Shame is when you have critical judgments about yourself. So there's a great discussion here about the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt may be because you did something wrong and you feel bad about this thing that you did. Shame is when it's internalized and it's, I am something wrong. I carry that something wrong with me even before I get a chance to do anything. So some really interesting stuff on this from the field of trauma, where we talk about understanding shame, calling it what it is, and replacing that self-judgment with curiosity and questions. Shame results when we answer a question negatively that we don't have the answer to. We just put that negative judgment on there instead of finding out the facts. And dealing with that inner critic can be pretty challenging. Some of us are our worst critics. If you're that kind of person who's really unhappy with what you did, but everybody else around you seems okay, maybe you're the harsh critic. And are you that harsh critic to yourself and to other people? So there are a couple other things besides what we just described that can limit your compassion. And a few of them are defined here. If you've ever caught yourself seeing people suffering and you go, well, I don't know them. What do they have to do with me? That's the identifiable victim effect. If something happens to your neighbor, you might be more prone to respond than someone far away. The feeling of there are too many people, too many of them for me to help. That's something called compassion fade. If I hear that there are, tens of thousands of homeless people in New York City, I might think, well, what can I do about that? It's too many, it's too much. Rather than focusing on, well, what can I do? What little can I do? I can't give them all someplace to live, but there might be something I can do. The third one is compassion fatigue, which we've talked about already, which is I've helped too many people already. We're giving away all of our effort to help other people, not taking care of ourselves, which ultimately diminishes our ability to help other people. We also have, as I mentioned before, our own traumas. So we have self-criticism, self-isolation, and self-absorption, and they're each connected to a trauma response: fight, flight, or freeze. So these are sort of our internal aspects that can cause us to reduce the amount of compassion we have. So here's your example of compassion fatigue. If any of you've seen the movie Office Space, if you haven't, you're welcome. Go see it. There's a great scene that I'm not going to give it away, but we talk about we give away all of our pieces of cake to everyone else, and then there's no cake left for us. And then we blame other people for taking all our cake. And in reality, there's a responsibility of us. Hold that piece back for yourself. Save a little something for yourself. If you're not taking good care of yourself, you're not taking good care of anybody else. Not for very long anyway. So particularly healthcare, which I've been privileged to work in for over 30 years now, has its own threats. And there's more than on this page. There's probably other ones. You probably have great stuff to add. One of the ones that I'm going to bring up primarily is the superhero complex, the idea that we are just supposed to keep going and not be human and just keep doing the job indefinitely. And at the time of recording this, we're about 10 months into the COVID quarantine. And we're learning that. We're just asking our first responders to go out there and just keep doing the job and keep doing the job, regardless of the human cost. And that doesn't work. There's a cumulative impact of that. We think we're superheroes, but we're probably more like these two gentlemen at the bottom of the screen who are sort of wannabe superheroes. Some of the other things that we run into is guilt that we're not doing enough, or attachment to the outcome. I watched people do CPR on somebody for 45 minutes and the person died. Did they fail? My answer would be no. They fought valiantly for that person for 45 minutes. And those of you who've done CPR, it's extraordinarily physically taxing. They did everything they could do. So there's a difference between if you come away from that feeling like you failed and come away from that saying, well, that was my absolute best shot. If anything was going to work, that was going to work. And you come away with actually sort of, I don't want to say pride, but glad in what you did. There's another one called anticipatory grief. We're all in a situation now where we don't know what we're going to lose and when we're going to lose it. And that's very difficult for us to deal with. And compromising self-care. And those of us who are in healthcare, we know the self-care thing is trouble. We eat a lot of junk food. We sacrifice our sleep. We go from one job where we take care of people to other places where we take care of people. So we really give ourselves a hard time with that. We are not supposed to be supermen and superwomen, even though we act like it. We are human. We have weaknesses. We need rest. But sometimes we need the care. And that's one thing I've noticed. People in healthcare, present company included, we make terrible patients because we don't want people to take care of us. It's our job to take care of other people. It's hard but necessary to switch roles. So I mentioned anticipatory grief before. It's a very difficult type of grief. Some of you who may have had very ill loved ones may have been through this, where you start the grieving process even though that person is still alive. You don't know when it's going to happen, but you do some of that work up front. Well, we are currently in a situation now where people are faced with economic losses, the loss of people around them, possibly the loss of their own health, maybe the loss of their own life, their own security. You don't know what you're going to lose, how severe it's going to be, or when it's going to happen. And that really messes with people's heads. If you knew that you had to be in a quarantine lockdown for 90 days, and after 90 days it was going to be over, you could hate it for 90 days, but you would do your 90-day countdown. Here, there's a big question mark at the end of it. So that is very stressful for people to deal with. And how do we tell the people that are essential staff, how much longer are we going to be in crisis mode? Crises are usually very short and very intense. This one's been stretched out, and at this time, we may not have that clear of an ending in sight. So how do we fix this? How do we get better? How do we address this compassion fatigue we're dealing with, or any of these other blockers to compassion that we have? First, compassion starts with you. If you don't take care of yourself, you can't help anyone else. My colleague, Dr. Michelle Zechner, gave a great metaphor of the oxygen mask analogy that you see when you travel on a plane. Put your oxygen mask on first. It doesn't mean you don't love your kids. It means that you have to not be drowning in order to help someone else from drowning. That's basically where we're going. Review your work-life balance. That's been a real challenge in the last year. A lot of people have had their work-life balance really shifted. Where is the balance? Where is the boundary? Especially for those of us working at home now. Where's the boundary when your home becomes your office, becomes your school, becomes your everything? What are your self-care practices? Are you eating better? Are you sleeping better? Have those bad habits like alcohol use and things like that, or fast food or whatever, have they picked up? How have your habits changed? When was the last time you took a break? When was the last time you took a vacation, even if it's just a sleep-in day? It's almost more the willingness to do the thing than it is the thing itself. Being able to forgive yourself. You're not perfect and you're not a superhero. You're just not. And it's okay that you're not. You're a good person and you're good at what you do. And that's good enough. Owning your limits. What is your mission? Why are you here? Some of it is about, okay, this is my job and I get paid to do this, and this keeps a roof over my head and food on the table. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But this is more of a statement about who you are as a person. This is what you do. We have moved from the sprint stage of the quarantine to the marathon stage of the quarantine, and that requires different strategies. What works for 60, 90 days may not work for a year. Disconnecting from the outcome. The outcome does not determine the quality of your effort, as I gave in the CPR example before. It is the quality of your effort. In fact, one of the things I'm actually a big fan of, judging the fight a person puts up when the fight is lost. That speaks very deeply to me about that person. If you don't believe me, watch the what they call the Jimmy V speech. Google that. And that's someone who knew they were dying but decided to do great things despite that, despite the situation they were in. So there's two things at the bottom here called the PCI and the PSCI. That's the personal chaos inventory and the personal self-care inventory. Those aren't included as part of this presentation, but my email's on the title slide. Please reach out to me. I'm happy to send them to you. Personal Chaos Index was made by Patrick Carnes. You can find that online and Google it. The PSCI is a version of the PCI that I made up, so you can reach out to me for that. And basically what they do, the Personal Chaos Index provides an evaluation of your habits and what habits do you either stop or start when you're under extreme stress, because you kind of fall into the same bad habits, or your little bad habits become bigger. The PSCI is the counter to that. So what is it you can do in the next week to improve your self-care? And I encourage you to reach out to me and get the test and do those two things. So considerations here. Who do you go to? Who's the person you go to when you're stressed out? If you're in healthcare, you're probably the go-to person for many people, but who do you go to? Who can you talk to? And it isn't that they have to have all the answers for you. It's just a place to go. What activities bring you around again and ground you? What are the things that help restore you, I should say? Is there a different way of looking at a situation so that it isn't, you don't view yourself in such a negative light? And are you trying to control something that cannot be controlled? So for example, if the politics of the day or things like that are impacting the personal parts of your life or the professional parts of your life, that's a problem. Obviously, there are things that you can control, like who you vote for and if you vote and all that good stuff. But to have those events impact your roles personally and professionally is where it becomes problematic. So we gave an example here. I'm really struggling today with anger and grief about what's going on at home and in the news, which is different than I did a terrible job with this client today. Own the fact that you're distracted by other things and reduce those distractions. And I would consider social media and news among those distractions. I think those are best taken in small doses. So the metaphor that gets used for compassion quite a bit is the well of compassion. And I love that metaphor because you send the bucket down and then you get the water and you give the water to other people. And if you allow time, the water will replenish itself. If you don't allow time, you just give away all the water, and then the bucket hits bottom and it's dry. Now there's no water for you and no water for anyone else. So I would really ask you to contemplate the how you refill your well. What sort of things do you think about? Do you feel? What behaviors? What daily practices? How do you get you back? I'll give you an example for myself. I want at least once every winter, I go to the beach, and it's usually a terrible day. It's windy, it's cold, it might even be raining a little bit. I just need to see the ocean. I need to watch the waves, like 20 minutes, and I get myself back again. I don't understand how that works, and I don't care. I just do it. That's something that I need to do. There are things that I do in the house, like do deep breathing exercises. There's all sorts of different kind of things I do to get me back, and I have to keep those things close by when I need them. There were times from work I would go right out to the beach in the middle of the night and just watch the waves. The waves would put me right. So whatever that is for you, and if you do the PSCI, that will give you a list of things that you do to get yourself back again. So a couple closing points here. Empathy is not the same as compassion, which compassion being specific to sharing the experience of suffering. Compassion is prominent in many religious traditions and in various types of spirituality, as you've seen in some of the illustrations. Self-compassion is where compassion starts. Be kind to yourself before you can be kind to others. Compassion can be enhanced and blocked by some of the many things that we described before. We have a lot of say over how we influence that. Very often it's how we look at a situation. Healthcare workers have specific threats to compassion, as we've discussed, some of them related to the specifics of work, the kind of work they do, the environment. But also the part is that we can emerge from these stressful situations stronger. If we learn how to convert our suffering into compassion and how to reduce our suffering, we become better at what we do in work. We become better for those that our loved ones around us. And then just even in having a sense of serenity about ourselves, which is critical, especially now. And I want to close with a story that you may have heard before. This was up on the wall at a hospital I used to work, and I really liked it. And I'll read it to you if you can't see it. It talks about an old man who had a habit of early morning walks on the beach. One day he saw a human figure in the distance moving like a dancer. As he came closer, he saw that it was a woman. She was not dancing, but reaching down into the sand, picking up starfish, and very gently throwing them back into the ocean. Young lady, he asked, why are you throwing starfish into the ocean? The sun's up and the tide's going out, and if I don't throw them in, they will die. The old man says, young lady, you don't realize there are miles and miles of beach and starfish all along the beach. You cannot possibly make a difference. The young woman listened politely, paused, and then bent down and picked up another starfish, throwing it back into the sea past the breaking waves. And she said, it made a difference for that one. So I think that's one of the takeaway points for me here. There's no way we can save all the starfish, but we can save some starfish. And then I think that also kind of helps regenerate us too. It's the act of helping as opposed to the act of being overwhelmed by the help. Last point, I was privileged enough to work in emergency rooms around the time of 9/11. And at that point, first responders such as the police and fire company got a tremendous amount of respect. People had always respected them, but just respected them so much more because of the work we do. My belief is now that with where we are now with the COVID thing, it's really become an emphasis on people who work in healthcare. And I finally think that people that like nurses and doctors and all of the people who work in healthcare are finally getting their due and getting their respect. And I would also ask you to take that in. It may seem very unglamorous and very difficult at this point, like I'm sure it was for all those people that worked around the 9/11 incident. But I think afterwards, when we step back from this, we're going to realize how vital the work you do really is. So I want you to have some of that with you. And if there's a takeaway point from this training, it would be that. So on behalf of myself, the people at the university, I thank you for all that you do. And I hope that in this way, this can help you to do what you do a little better and maybe even enjoy it a little bit more. So here are some of the sources that I got this material from. And if you want to look up our videos, you can look up, my name's Ken Kinter. You can look up my channel on YouTube and it's there. There is also a site, a rutgers.edu site that has all sorts of educational videos, and you can find that as well. If you have any other questions, don't hesitate to email me. It was a pleasure talking to you today, and I hope this helped, and I hope to catch up with you sometime again soon. and you can check out our other videos. Take care.